We Rotarians are members of a service organization that has spearheaded something no other service organization has ever done, and hopefully will never, ever have to do again. We are on the threshold of eradicating a dread, awful, evil, ugly, nasty disease called polio. But let's remember, when polio was at its worst in the world and entered the life of a family who has experienced the disease at its height, this letter I will now read was written by my mother, the mother of that family, the mother of 5 young boys, my family. She wrote this letter when she was 89 years old. Dear Carl, this is very hard for me, but you asked me and just maybe it will help someone else. It must have been August 7th, 1942, when Bill came in and announced he had poliomyelitis. I didn't know where he had heard of such, but I said, if you have poliomyelitis, you go out straight up to bed and stay there, and he did. He really did feel bad. We did the usual things to care of a sick person. He stayed in bed at least a couple of days. And then George, the oldest boy, became ill. I called Dr. Eldridge, our pediatrician, and he came several times but didn't give the illness a name until the night of August 11th. George couldn't swallow his medication. It came back up through his nose. I called the doctor again and he came right over. Dad was on the road selling. I don't remember who stayed with the others, but Dr. Eldridge took George and me to Old General Hospital. They took George but wouldn't let me stay at all. No other hospital in Kansas City would accept us. I sputtered, but they wouldn't even let me go with George. I went home and called Dad. He started home immediately, drove all night, and went to the hospital around 4 a.m., but they wouldn't let him in either. He came home, and at about 7 a.m., the hospital called and said George was dying, to come immediately, which we did. When we arrived, George was already gone. He was tied to the bed, feet at each corner of the bed, hands over his head, and fastened at each corner, stripped naked. We stayed in his room as long as they would let us, and of course, Dad had to make arrangements, which he did. I firmly believe George probably would have passed away anyway, as he had bulbar polio, the most virulent strain, and probably choked on his own juices. However, I will always believe the treatment he received at the hospital killed him just as much as the disease. And I believe he was frightened to death and will always think so. By that time, Richard, Larry, and Carl had also become sick. And when I got home from the hospital, Richard was much worse, and we rushed him to the hospital. When we marched in, I am informed them I was staying. I had lost one child, and I was staying no matter what. I don't remember how long, but Dad and I took turns, so Richard always had one of us there. One of Dad's aunts had come to help us and stayed with Bill, Larry, and Carl. Carl was an infant and stayed in his crib much of the time. An intern was watching Richard and doing a pretty good job. One night, Richard wasn't doing well, and during the intern's coffee break, I saw Richard's skin sink into his chest. All I could see were bones covered with skin drawn tight. I ran as fast as I could down the hall, calling the intern. He joined me, and we ran back to Richard, and this man picked Richard up and punched him into an iron lung. He didn't fight it, but breathed along with it. His lungs had collapsed. The radio stations throughout Kansas City put out a call for anyone who had had polio to please go to the hospital and give blood to save this little boy's life. One young man or boy answered and gave his blood. I am most grateful to this unknown person. Richard was whiter than this paper and failing. The machine was breathing for him. But when they started giving him the boy's blood, it was like a perfect miracle. His skin gradually started turning the most beautiful pink anyone has ever seen, and he started coming back. I don't remember how long we were at the hospital, but they treated us much better. When we went home, we had to start the Kinney treatments. There was one nurse at the old Children's Mercy Hospital who would give the treatments if Dad would go after her and take her back 3 times a week. Since it was wartime, gasoline was rationed and we didn't have enough gas stamps. But people we had never heard of, and some we knew quite well, gave us stamps so we could get this nurse. For those of you who don't know what the Kinney treatments are, we had to have 100% wool blankets to tear into strips and put in boiling water, run through a tight wringer and place on each child for so many minutes, then off for so many minutes, then on, etc. Can you imagine, as a parent, what hell you have to go through in dealing with polio? Bill was on his way to recovery, but Richard, Larry, and Carl were the sick ones now. Dad hired nurses to help during the day, and my dear mother drove from Concord, California to help, plus a very loyal girl who had helped me for several years, who had become a WAC in the Army. We were one busy Army ourselves. When the boys were well enough, we had start therapy, compliments of the March of Dimes. I took my children and another lady in leg braces and her little boy 3 times a week. People came from everywhere to give us hope and offer to help, but they couldn't come in the house. We were quarantined. Post-polio syndrome is rampant now. Fatigue is the main symptom. It took 60 years for my mother to write this letter and to talk about polio. My dad never did. That is the legacy of polio. While polio has been eradicated for decades from many parts of the world, my family's experience is reoccurring in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan today. We must not forget. Our mission is clear: eradicate polio. In the words of that great theologian of our time, Dr. Theodore Seuss Geisel, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. As Rotarians, we're doers. We are going to do a lot. Robert Frost, in his poem Stopping by Woods, ended it by saying, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." Isn't that Rotary? We've made some mighty tall promises. We've got miles to go before we keep them. Thank you for being Rotarians.